Good morning, ninth graders. I hope you are all doing well. Today, this is Wednesday, March 25th, and we're going over the 7th poem, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. This is one of my favorite poems to teach, and I hate that we're not in the classroom together to do it. But let's get started. Okay, so I know you've already looked at this poem a little bit on Common Lit. Remember that for this one and for the one tomorrow, you should be logging in this week and doing Common Lit first before you watch my videos. But this poem is one of the most often misunderstood poems out there. It really is. You see parts of this poem on posters, in classrooms and around, and I misunderstood this poem when I was in middle school and high school and had the last few lines, written on notebooks and all this kind of stuff. I thought it was my favorite poem and all of that, which I do still really love it. Then when I got to college, I had a professor who actually taught us how to explicate poems, which, as we've learned through these past several poems, requires you to read carefully, to read it multiple times, and to pay attention to everything that the poet's doing, including punctuation. And so that's whenever I learned what the poem really means. And I like it just as much, but for different reasons now. So I hope that you're gonna enjoy it as well. All right, let's start with a read. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. All right, so this poem has very often been read as a nonconformist's creed. Do you know what nonconformist is? To conform means to fall in line and do the same kind of things that everybody else is doing. So if you're not conforming, you're going against that. You're doing your own thing, okay? And so that's why you'll often see these last two lines, like I said, on posters and things like that. And it really speaks to us, particularly as Americans, because that is, the American way. Strike out on your own, do your own thing. Don't follow the crowd, all good things. So I think that's why this one resonated so much with so many people. This is a very popular poem. But let's go through and explicate it and look at what the poem's actually saying. Okay, we start out by setting the scene. So you should be able to get a very clear image in your mind. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. So what does he mean by yellow wood? You know how in the fall where the leaves on some types of trees, don't ask me what kind, start to turn yellow, that beautiful golden color, you have all different colors in the fall, but we're looking at that really beautiful golden yellow color. So obviously our speaker is walking, and he gets to kind of a Y in the road, right? And so he's been walking this way. So there's two different paths that are split here in this yellow wood where he's out walking. He says he's sorry he could not travel both. Okay, so he would like to be able to go down each of them. What does that tell us? That tells us that both paths are appealing, right? He's sorry he could not travel both and be one traveler. So long I stood, so it takes him a long time to make the decision for which way he's going to go. He stands there for a long time and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. So he stands there and kind of looks down as far as he can, can't really see. And then he takes the other as just as fair. It takes him a long time to decide. Both paths are appealing. He tries to look as far as he can to try to see if he can tell where it heads, but you can't tell where it's going. One might lead to a parking lot, one might lead to a beautiful waterfall. You have no idea. They both look equally appealing that day as he's trying to figure out which one he wants to go down. Now, pretty obviously, this is a major metaphor and is very symbolic for choices in life, right? We're familiar with that paths have to do with choices, okay? So think about what some big choices might be, where it would be difficult to decide. Probably the next ones you've got coming up will be things like course of study, like will you do dual enrollment or not? And then even bigger than that is what you'll do after graduation. What college are you going to go to, or what path, or are you going to go in the military, or are you going to go straight into the workforce? Or are you going to go to a tech school and learn a trade and make more money than all of us? So, there's so many options. And that is probably the best, the best example as far as a difficult choice. Because there's not a right answer. You know what I mean? Like, unless one of your choices is, I'm going to start living under a bridge and killing people for fun, that's a poor choice. But the others are all viable choices. You could go in the military, you could go to trade school, you can go to college, you can go straight into the workforce. Like, all of those are good choices. There's nothing wrong with any of those. So that's what makes it difficult, okay? So I want you to understand that we definitely have the metaphor of these paths, these two roads here, being like choices that you would make in life. And in what sense do we look down one as far as we can? Well, we try to figure out, let's take the colleges, for example. I remember whenever I was a junior and I was going around with my mom visiting colleges, and I applied to several different ones and we visited all of them. This is before the internet, so there wasn't an internet to look at. You could look at a catalog, but to really get a sense, you had to go, and I still advise people to do that, go to the campus. And, there wasn't a wrong choice, so it was very difficult to make. Like, they were all accredited, obviously, they were all good schools, so it really just comes down to eventually you just got to pick one. But the reason it's so scary is that we're very aware that the choices we make are going to start closing some doors for us. Not in a bad way, but, think about it. Once you start out on a path, you tend to stay on that path. And so, very often you talk to most people my age, and the career they decided on, perhaps the person they married, where they decided to live, all of that was pretty much formed by where they went to college and the people they were around and what experiences they had and all of that. So I think that's why it's such a terrifying choice, because you're aware that it's going to impact the rest of your life decisions generally and in a pretty big way, but there's no way to know what the right choice is. Okay, so what do? So he does finally make a choice, okay? He takes one. He says he took the other as just as fair. Immediately after he chooses and starts walking down one of the paths, look at what he does. He says, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. So he immediately starts sort of self-congratulating, oh, this was a better path. It's more grassy, not as many people have been down it. This was a good decision. But then he admits, you have to look at what he's admitting here, though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same. He's told us all throughout that first stanza, and he's admitting it again here, that the paths are equal. There's no way to tell what's the better path. That's why it was a hard decision. Okay? So why then did he start congratulating himself right here? Why did he start saying, well, maybe this one has the better claim. It's grassy. It needs wear. Well, I think that's human nature. Very often that's what we do. We make a decision, and it was a tough decision, and if you're an optimist, you start looking at all the good points of that decision. Like, well, I'm glad I chose this because this is going to mean blah, 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 blah. And we have to do that. It's really a self-preservation technique. If we don't do that, I don't need to be sitting here 48 years old like, oh, but what if I'd gone to Davidson? You know what I mean? Like, it's it's futile. You'll drive yourself crazy. So we do tell ourselves like, oh, I'm glad I went to the school I went to, that I met these certain professors, and that impacted what career choice I made, and that got me the job that I have, and I think it's self-preservation, because you can't drive yourself crazy over these decisions that you have to make in life. So he admits again that both that morning equally lay, equally, in leaves no step had trodden black. So both of them that morning were beautiful, equal. Neither one of them had leaves that had been trodden black. You know what that means, right? Like, it's fall, there's the golden leaves on the trees, but when they start to fall, at first they're real pretty on the ground, but once people start walking back and forth on them a lot, they kind of turn into that, black or brown sort of mush. And so neither one of these have been walked on that morning. They're both beautiful. They both have golden leaves on the path. But he has chosen one. And so he says, oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. And that's generally true, isn't it? Once you make a decision and head out on a path, usually you stay on that path. Now, not always. For instance, I started off at Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, but then after a year, when they raised tuition tremendously, but didn't raise people's scholarships, because I was there on a full scholarship, I made the decision to transfer to Georgia College here in Milledgeville and finished up there. So I did kind of wind up coming back to that crossroad a little bit. But both were equal. Like, I'm very thankful for my time at Oglethorpe, and I'm very thankful for my time at Georgia College. If I hadn't gone there, I never would have found out about GMC and wouldn't be teaching all of you. So, very thankful that I made that decision. But they were equal choices, okay? But once you start down a path, you tend to stay on that path. Because he says, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. So we don't normally find ourselves back at the same crossroads, That's kind of unusual. Once you choose a path, you pretty much stay down it and keep going. So, last stanza. This is the important one. Look at what he says in these first two lines. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. There's two very important parts in this. One is the word this, and the other one is that colon right there. Okay? So, the reason this is important is because you have to figure out what it refers to. That's an indefinite pronoun, right? You got to figure out what is he talking about. The this that he's going to be telling is the last three lines. Okay? That's what this is. And the reason we know that is because of the colon. What does a colon as a form of punctuation, gosh, it's hard to write with this, what does that tell us? Well, probably all of you are like, oh, it means a list is coming. Yes, it is often used for a list, but that's not the only thing that a colon means. A colon can also mean that further explanation is coming. Okay? So, the further explanation is the this. He says, I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. So he already knows that years from now, in the future, he's going to be telling this story. He's going to sigh dramatically and say, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, what's the important thing here? That's what he's going to tell people. He's already decided that. That's the story he's going to tell. That's how he's going to tell this story of these two roads that diverged in a wood one morning. But it's not the truth. We determined the truth throughout the whole rest of the poem. They were equal. He had a hard time making the decision. As soon as he chose one, he was like, well, this is probably better. But he immediately admits, no, they're about the same. So why is he going to lie? He's going to lie in the future. He's going to have this big sigh and this very dramatic story that there were the two roads and I took the one less traveled by, and that made all the difference. Well, we all kind of like to have ourselves come off well in our own stories, don't we? So he knows himself. He knows that even though the roads were pretty equal, years down the road, he's going to look back and he's going to congratulate himself. He's going to pat himself on the back. I made the right decision. I chose the one less traveled by. Even though it's a lie. That's a complete and total lie. But it's what he's going to tell himself, and it's what he's going to tell others. And I do think that Frost is right here with the fact that that's what human nature tends to do. We do tend to do that. So, is your mind blown? It may not be if you had not experienced this poem before. Mine was. Because so often when people read the poem, they just kind of fixate on those last few lines. And they're like, yes, take the road less traveled by. Be different from everybody else. But this is where explication of poetry becomes important. When you truly look at the full poem, you realize what the poet actually intended. And this is very like Frost. Frost tends to have this reputation as being this sort of old, grandfatherly poet, but he was very much a product of his time in the modern era, and most of his poems do have a kind of darkness to them. If you read more of his poetry, you'll see that. So I really like teaching this poem because I think that it really exemplifies why explicating a poem is so very important. Okay, so what are the literary elements that are important here? Well, diction, obviously, is pretty huge. That's the poet's word choice. And there's not really a word for punctuation choice, but that kind of ties in there as well, because that final stanza both reveals what's actually going to happen, and through the way he frames it, the way he sets it up, misleads the reader, just as the speaker is going to mislead people in the future when he tells the story. So I think that's really important, and I think diction is important throughout the whole poem, because you have to really look at what he is saying, okay? The other, of course, obviously, is going to be that this is a major metaphor. It's an extended metaphor, because the whole poem itself, right, is talking about how choices, we recognize that the two paths in the woods here are tied into choices that we make in life. So that's another really big one. And then lastly, I think imagery is one that we would really have to talk about, because you really have to picture those two paths and how they're golden with the leaves falling and how they're equally fair and all of that kind of stuff. So really using the imagery there of picturing that scene, I think, is very important as well. Okay? So, that's the explanation for that poem. I think you certainly should be able to write about the speaker here, what you think about him. Consider what the tone is. And again, you can remember the tone can change. So if you want to put more than one tone, that's okay. And I hope you're doing well. I hope you stay well. I hope you stay inside. And I miss y'all.